Welcome everybody from New Jersey and elsewhere. It's nice to see you all here. So, as you can imagine, it's really fun to do a keynote to my own screen, but I'm really delighted to be with you all this morning, so I appreciate the invite. As noted, I'm an associate professor of educational leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver. That means I prepare principals and superintendents to lead K-12 schools all around the world. And I get a chance to work with schools all over the globe in terms of school transformation. How do we rethink learning and teaching and schooling for the demands of today and tomorrow? I do a lot of that work through my center, CASTLE, which Rich also mentioned. CASTLE is the only university center dedicated to the technology needs of school leaders. So spent a lot of time thinking about concepts like distance learning and digital learning and so on. So I think that's why I got the invite today. If you want to follow along, my slides are available at this web address on the screen, and I'm going to give you a minute to get that down and just talk about a couple of things while we're here. I know that some of you are active on social media, so there are some Twitter addresses and hashtags that you can use as part of this conversation. I encourage you to share out any thoughts or resources that come to mind during this keynote. We'll also recognize, of course, that for many of us, the events of the last week or so have been very unsettling around the country. And, you know, in fact, the last few months, many of us are struggling with stay-at-home orders. I know that the pandemic has hit New Jersey particularly hard. So I just want to mention up front that although we're having this conference on online learning, and we're talking about some really important stuff related to learning and teaching in both higher ed and K-12, that we do operate within larger contexts, right? So I hope that everyone is being safe and hopefully is healthy. And my thoughts and care and empathy come out from Colorado to all of you on the East Coast. And also, you know, in light of the last few days, just want to give a shout out to Newark and Camden, who are showing us the way to think about some of these larger concerns that are filtering through society right now. And showing us that there are ways that we can come together in ways that are productive. And so while it may seem that some of those bigger issues are taking precedence right now, of course, we also need to think about the learning and teaching that we're providing our students and the supports that we're giving our staff and our administrators and our communities during this time. So I just want to be cognizant of that before I dive into what's probably a more mundane topic of online learning and deeper learning. So I'm actually going to start my presentation by telling you 3 stories from Colorado. Now these are P-12 stories, primarily at the high school level. But hang with me because I'll segue into the higher ed stuff as we go along here. And my first story is about sharks. And that may seem like a funny story to you because we don't really have sharks in Colorado, right? But I'm going to invite you to watch this video for a few seconds. Terrifying, right? And the people who go into those shark cages are much braver than I am. But let me ask you this question. How long was that shark? Now that's a tough question to ask, right? Because as you remember from the video, the water is murky, it's green, there's no reference points to judge against, right? It's just the shark swimming against this pale green background. And it's a very interesting question, actually. You know, how would we measure this shark? And so I'm going to give you 60 seconds, and you're welcome to throw your thoughts into the chat area. What are your ideas for how we might measure the shark? Okay, time's up. Now this is the part where I really miss seeing you all in person, right? Because I could hear some of your ideas, and we could throw a few out there. You know, I tend to do very interactive keynotes, and I'm going to give you some periodic reflections like I just gave you throughout our time this morning. Short blocks of time where you can throw some thoughts in the chat area, interact with each other, and so on. So that was kind of your test as we get going here. So that's the question that I asked, how long is the shark, is actually a real question. We had a scientist in Boulder, Colorado, who was trying to figure out a way to answer that question. She's a marine biologist and researcher. And so she actually came to some students here in a local high school and said, can you help me figure this out? And so some students up in Longmont, Colorado, created, after much testing, the device that you see on your screen. Now that device is actually upside down right now. The handle is pointing up, not down. And what you see here in the next slide is you see the assistant superintendent of the district demonstrating how this works. So you hold the device by the handle, and there's a place on the top for a GoPro camera, and then there are things on the ends which are actually lasers. Okay, and so what they did is they calibrated this against images of sharks that they put up on the wall in their school. And then the idea is that you would point this device at the shark, you would measure the endpoints, and then from there you could sort of calculate the length of the shark while it was swimming. So very ingenious, clever solution. So that's story one from Colorado about sharks. Here's story number two. It's about frogs. You know, here in Colorado, we're at high elevation, and another area that's high elevation is Lake Titicaca in Peru, up in the Indian Mountains there. It's about 12,500 feet above sea level. And one of the challenges that they're having there in the lake is that the wild frog population has declined about 80% over the last 3 generations. It is now classified as critically endangered. So we have scientists in the Denver Zoo, for example, who are working with some colleagues there in Peru to try and preserve the species. Now, one of the challenges about doing this work at altitude is that it's very difficult to scuba dive in high altitude environments. Individuals that dive at high altitudes are exposed to atmospheric pressures that are less than sea level, which is the presumed endpoint for standard decompression tables. And then when you surface, the decreased atmospheric pressure in the environment exerts an increased decompression stress on the diver. And so, you know, there's some basic rules of thumb that if you're diving at altitude, you have to stay shallow and keep it short to limit the amount of accumulated gas in your body tissues. And so, as you can imagine, this makes it really hard to dive down deep into the lake and see what's happening with these frogs. So the folks at the Denver Zoo, some of those scientists, heard what was happening with the shark project. And so they came to these high school students again, and they said, hey, we understand that you're interested in aquatic robotics. And so what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to work with us to test and create some sample aquatic robots that we can use to investigate sharks, right? And so here is an image of the aquatic robotics lab. You can see the giant tank where they test some of their equipment. Here's a surface level robot that the students made. And then they have underwater robots as well that they can send down underneath the surface of the lake to test salinity and water quality and, you know, visibility and other, you know, chemical composition issues related to the frogs as they try to figure out why the population has decreased so drastically and what scientists and local communities can do about it. Now, as part of this robotics project, the students also had to work with local communities, right? Because a lot of the issue was related to local pollution in the lake. And so they started creating sort of these frog conservation messaging activities. They had to educate local children and adults about, you know, the amphibians in their neighborhood. They created a Spanish language comic book that explains the science to locals and why they should care. Like there's all kinds of good stuff happening here above and beyond the robotics work, right? Where students are figuring out ways to use their speaking and writing and listening skills, creating publicity and marketing materials and education materials for the local community, working with scientists. And one of the things I love about this frog project is that most of the students working on this project were Spanish speakers, right? And as their native language. And so in schools, we often treat ESL students as challenges, but in this case, of course, their language skills were assets because they were able to converse with the scientists down in Peru in their native language in ways that, English-speaking only Americans could not, which was pretty great. And the third story I'm going to tell you from Colorado is about space. So I had a chance to visit Lakewood High School recently in Lakewood, Colorado, and I met this young gentleman. And you can see that he's wearing a harness. And the reason he's wearing a harness is because he is trying to figure out how to help astronauts in space stay fit. Now, you can imagine that this is a challenge for astronauts because you can't exactly take a bunch of weightlifting equipment up into space because the mass is too great, and every ounce counts, right? So what he has here is he has a harness that he's wearing, and if you look right there, there's that strap that kind of goes between his legs, and there's a ring there. And what that ring is for is that you can attach that ring to a resistance cable that comes up from the floor. So here he is testing it outside the high school, right? And so you can imagine a cable that comes out of the floor of the space station, for instance, and clips onto the ring. And now you can attach it to the harness, and then you can engage in resistance training and build up your leg muscles with the tension from the cable. And so what he's doing is he's testing out this harness, and they're also trying to figure out how can they make it in such a way so that it it doesn't absorb too much moisture, that, because astronauts sweat and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of other design considerations besides, the harness itself. And so what's great about this is that Lakewood High School has figured out a way to partner with NASA and to conduct a variety of different experiments that will benefit our astronauts up in space. So another experiment that I saw students working on while I was there, another project, was they were trying to figure out how can you wash materials up in space with something ridiculous like 10 milliliters of water, right? And so they created these collapsible cloth-like buckets, right, that are lined with foil, and there's batteries and radiation and so on. I don't understand all the technicalities of it, but then they're actually testing chemically washed t-shirts and unwashed to see if they can get rid of the bacteria and so on. And so all three of these projects in Colorado, although they're examples of high school students, not college students, are examples of what we might call deeper learning. And when we think about deeper learning, we have to recognize what some of those practices are. One of those practices is this concept of student agency. It's this idea that students have a lot of ownership and control of what and when they learn and with whom and how and why, right? And the idea here is that in an environment that's high in student agency, that it's much less teacher controlled or system controlled, and students have a lot of choice and voice in what they're learning. And there's lots of advantages to student agency. So for instance, the cognitive psychologists remind us that one of the primary factors, if not the primary factor in human motivation, is a sense of autonomy, right? And so what we have to think about is that, in our K-12 environments, in our higher ed environments, do we allow students to have some voice and choice and agency and control and ownership of their own learning? Or is it primarily directed by us as instructors, as organizations and institutions and so on? Are we creating high autonomy learning spaces or low autonomy learning spaces? And if we create low autonomy learning spaces, which is very prevalent in K-12, for instance, then we shouldn't be surprised when we struggle with student motivation and engagement, right? Student agency also allows for a lot more personalization of the learning process, allows us to individualize and differentiate in other ways. So lots of advantages to student agency. And I hope that you saw a lot of that student agency in the work that I showed you from Colorado. A second big aspect of deeper learning is this concept of authentic work, this idea that rather than doing isolated, siloed academic work in the classroom, that you're connecting with the real world outside of schools. That now all of a sudden, students stop asking us, why do I need to know this or why do I care? Because they're actively connecting with their local communities, online communities, global communities. They're doing work that seems to matter. And so they understand the relevance and meaning of what they're being asked in a way that's very different from many traditional classrooms. The third key aspect of deeper learning, of course, is higher level thinking, right? How do we move beyond those lower level thinking tasks, what many people consider foundational stuff like factual recall and procedural regurgitation, the basics of the discipline. And how do we allow students to engage in tasks of greater cognitive complexity, where they're engaged in more critical thinking and problem solving? They have opportunities to be creative communicators and collaborators. In other words, they're living more often on the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge wheel than the lower ones. And then finally, another aspect of deeper learning might be, how do we infuse technology into that, right? How do we move out of analog spaces and into rich, robust digital and online spaces where we're using these tools to connect with others and do more powerful work in ways that we just couldn't do without the technology, which I think is going to be a big theme of the conference today. And so as you think about those four big shifts of student agency and higher level thinking and more authentic work and technology infusion, I think the question for us in our own university classrooms and learning spaces is, what opportunities do our students have to engage in deeper learning? So I'm going to take a pause here and give you 90 seconds to reflect on that and to share whatever ideas you have in the public chat space. Of this conference is, of course, right? And I think as we try to do that work, as we try to connect sort of some of these deeper learning shifts or paradigms, right, around higher level thinking and authentic work and student agency and using technology to help facilitate those, we have to recognize a couple contextual challenges within which we're operating. And the first contextual challenge that I want to highlight here is just this basic concept of information literacy. Neil Postman reminded us decades ago that a new medium doesn't add something, that it actually changes everything around us. You know, the last time we lived through a shift in our information landscape that was as big as the one that we're living through right now was back when we invented the printing press. And as Postman notes, you know, it wasn't just that we had Europe and then we had Europe plus the printing press, as that the printing press was a seismic shift in society, you know, as the masses were able to gain access to information for the first time ever, rather than being filtered through the local priest or the king's representative. They could access the laws themselves. They could access the word of the Bible themselves, for instance. That this had major, major impacts on everything in Europe, right? Like entire governments were toppled. We had new branches of religion and so on, right? And we're living through similar seismic shifts today in our information landscape. You know, we now have more access to information than we ever had before, but we also have some other things happening as well. So the left side of this slide really shows you what our old information landscape looks like. This is the printing press landscape, right? Information was primarily organized around ink on paper. It was very expensive to get a book or a newspaper out, or a magazine, for instance, right? You think about all the costs related to the ink, the paper, and the glue, and the binding, and the distribution channels, and the marketing, and the relationships with the, you know, the bookstores or the magazine stands or whatever, right? And because it was expensive, we lived in a filter and then publish world. Some entity, like a publishing company or the government or maybe a large corporation or university, would make the decision about who was worth the expense of publishing, right? So they would take your submission for a magazine article or newspaper article or book or your movie idea or your radio broadcast idea or whatever it was, right? And they would decide, well, enough people listen to this that we can get our money back, or when enough people read this that we can make a profit, right? And so there were gatekeepers who filtered the ideas and the thinking, and then the rest of us just sort of consumed whatever those entities decided to publish. It was very much an expert-only sort of paradigm, and information was relatively scarce because it was expensive. And of course, you know, the ink on paper world was slow to change. You know, many of us had encyclopedias on our shelves or at the libraries that were out of date the instant that they were printed, right, and so on. We have now, of course, live in this digital online space, which is the category of the words on the right here of this slide, right? And these bits in the ether, of course, are free or essentially low cost. Almost everyone has the ability to be a publisher these days or a broadcaster these days. there's nobody filtering what we put out there, and that's a wonderful thing, because on the one hand, we're hearing from many more ideas and many more people than we ever would have before in the filtered and published schema. But we're also, of course, sifting through a lot more crap and content that may be less valuable as well. It's much more participatory space. It's an active space. People are sharing in real time. It's much more interactive. The reach is, exponentially greater than ink on paper. We now live in this weird time where a 12-year-old can have something go viral and have the same reach as a major multimedia company. We just haven't quite wrapped our head around it yet. As we think about this new information landscape, one of the things we're finding, of course, is that students are really struggling to judge the credibility of information online. We have study after study that shows that our young people don't really understand how to sift through all the stuff on the internet and through all their digital channels and figure out what's reliable and valid and credible and so on. And yet, as much as they struggle, what we find is that older Americans are struggling even more, right? And so we also have studies that say that for all of us adults who, bemoan the state of our youth, that the older we get, the actually more likely we are to struggle with information validity and reliability. And that's just on the consumption side. And what we're also realizing, of course, is that we have to stop thinking of the internet as a place to just look up stuff. That it's not just a consumption space. It's not like a book that we pull off the shelf and we dig through what we want and then we put it back, right? As that, the information landscape that we're now in is a participatory space. It's an interactive space. And, in the ink on paper world, we would never say that somebody was literate if they could read but not write, as Mitch Resnick from MIT notes. But, then we have to do the counterpart question, which is, then are we literate if we're only consuming content online, but we're not producing content online? And I think for many of our instructors in higher ed and K-12, because they may not be active creators and sharers and publishers in these online spaces, it's difficult for them to teach what they don't know. And so, we have to think really hard as higher ed instructors, as K and 12 instructors, how well are we preparing students to master the dominant information landscape of their time? How well are we helping people understand and participate in this interactive space, right, where you have exponential reach, where you're hyper-connected, where things happen in real time, which causes whole new lenses on the work. And where nobody is filtering for us, where we have to do that filtering in our own minds instead. And so as you think about the online context in which our online learning and teaching are operating, right? Are you keeping it primarily siloed within your learning management system and within university-approved spaces? Are you getting kids and young people and older students connected to the world outside of the university in ways that are productive and help them master the right side of that slide? So I'm going to give you another 90 seconds to reflect and just think about how well are we doing at helping students master our new information landscape. Okay, welcome back. And again, this is hard for me because I don't get to see you, so I can't see what you're thinking and what you're sharing and what you're talking about. I hope you're using our public chat space in a way that's productive for you, in addition to whatever your own thoughts and notes are that you're recording. I think the other contextual challenge that I just want to highlight here as we think about online learning and deeper learning is this concept of career readiness or life readiness. And down at K-12, we would also add college readiness, right? And I think, as you think about this new information landscape and the impacts of technology in society, maybe nowhere has it had a greater impact than the world of work. So you think about all the jobs that have been lost to offshoring, where we take jobs that used to exist in our country and we have now sent them overseas because the labor is much cheaper, right? So the globalization of the economy. This idea of outsourcing, where in the past you might have a full-time job in the human resources department, for example, or the data entry department in your company or organization, and now we've decided to outsource that to a private contractor. instead of keeping the work in-house. And yes, you can go get a job at the contractor instead of the organization, but the bottom line is the contractor probably pays less, probably has less robust benefits, if any benefits at all, and so on, right? And so we've taken millions of jobs and we've sent them overseas to where the labor is cheaper. We've also taken millions of jobs and we've outsourced them to less economically stable work providers, right, in terms of job security and benefits and so on. And then, of course, there's the whole impact of automation. And we have figured out ways to automate both physical labor jobs, such as, drilling screws into car doors at the local Ford factory. But also, we figured out ways to automate service jobs, what we might consider more white-collar work or maybe even pink-collar work. And the idea here is that it's not just our blue-collar workers who've been automated, right? You can think about things like ATMs and online travel websites and other places where we've created algorithms and self-service websites and apps on our phones. In other words, where we're moving the work into the hands of consumers, which is great, right? But also has had major impacts in terms of job loss. And when you add all those up, what we're finding in the American economy is that the only job growth over the past 5 or 6 decades has been in the area of non-routine analytical work and non-routine interpersonal work. This is that complex cognitive mental work that machines can't do yet, although AI seems to be giving us a run for the money. And any kind of manual labor job or routine cognitive job, we've seen steady declines and stagnation over the past few decades. And so the economists call this the bifurcation of the American economy. If you have those higher level thinking skills that I talked about earlier as one of the 4 aspects of deeper learning, right, that there seem to be a steady number of jobs available to you. And if you're engaged in any kind of routine mental work, like say a bank teller or somebody who does data entry, or an administrative assistant or customer service rep and so on, or any kind of manual labor job, we're figuring out ways to automate those and outsource and offshore those jobs. And so we have this bifurcation, right? And we have to figure out, how do we get more of our students and more of our graduates along the upper pathway, not just the lower pathway. And that's true for both higher ed and K-12. We're seeing the same concerns across all developed countries. So for example, here's the data in Europe, and it's a little hard to read this chart. But what you'll notice is that you will see a small percentage increase in low-paying jobs. These are primarily manual labor and service sector kind of jobs like home health care aid, right? We're seeing a much larger increase in each European country, those brown bars, in high-paying, highly cognitively complex jobs, and the whole middle has just fallen out of the economy in basically every country in Europe as well. And this also would include Australia and New Zealand and Taiwan and Israel, and Hong Kong, and any other country that we might consider a developed country at this point, is they're seeing these same bifurcations happen within their economies. The end result here in the US, of course, has been that while we're more productive than we've ever been as a nation, right, our GDP continues to increase, that the average worker has not shared in that growth, in that increased productivity, right? Like their compensation has not risen accordingly. And I think we're seeing this in a lot of the political movements right now, where we're saying lots, tens of millions of people angry that they're being left behind as those who own the capital continue to do well, and those who are the workers, because of these global trends, have not kept up. And so it seems to be pretty clear that the skills that our economy is rewarding right now are these upper level, cognitively complex skills, these deeper learning mentalities that go far beyond sort of basic factual recall and procedural skill development. And so I think it's an open question for us as we think about the economic and workforce aspects of our work, is how well are we doing at helping our students become career and life ready, as opposed to simply being knowledge absorbers and then knowledge regurgitators. And so, although, particularly in universities, we are very concerned with this fact that, we're not just about preparing our students and graduates to be worker bees for, the multinational corporation, but we also have to recognize that people need to get jobs. They need to be able to support their families and themselves throughout life. And so how do we help our students live at those higher levels of cognitive complexity more often so that they can become more career ready and have greater chances at life success? So why don't you think about that for 90 seconds, and then we'll come back and talk about how we start designing for some deeper learning. Awesome, welcome back. So we have been thinking about contextual challenges, right? How do we think about online learning and deeper learning, and what are the contexts in which we're operating that sort of frame that work? What I want to do in our last sort of 12 minutes or so here is think about a key implementation challenge, which is how do we design for deeper learning within online learning spaces? And I'm going to do that by starting with a fourth story, right? And a fourth story is about 8th grade me. And so here are some pictures of me in 8th grade. As you can tell, I was quite the looker. And I was going through some old yearbooks recently, and realized that at Hidden Valley Junior High School in the early 80s in Roanoke, Virginia, which is where I was at the time, but I actually was in the math club, which I didn't remember at all. That's me, second from the left on the front. And what was great about math club apparently was not only did Mr. Johnson say that I was a genius, which was pretty sweet of him. Thank you, Mr. Johnston. But I also love this picture, right? Because apparently in math club, we were exposed to this device right here, right? And I love the picture on my face because everybody else is sort of looking at this device in sort of wonder. And I have this really hesitant look on my face, like, what the heck is this thing and what does it mean? And back in the early 80s, we didn't really know what these devices were going to do to us. 8th grade me was very familiar with this kind of math work, right? Where I would do some basic procedural skill development. But 8th grade me did not know that pretty soon we would evolve these small miniature portable devices, right? Where I could simply ask the question verbally and get the answer to those questions. And 8th grade me was very familiar with this kind of language arts English work, right? Where I would be matching, terms with definitions and so on. And again, 8th grade me had no idea that with a quick voice command on the device in my pocket, I could answer those questions. 8th grade me was very familiar with this kind of science work. Here's a physics question from my daughter's physics textbook. And I love this question, right? A person pulls a toboggan for a distance of 35 meters along the snow with a rope directed 25 degrees above the snow. The tension in the rope is 94 newtons. How much work is done on the toboggan by the tension force? How much work is done on the same tension directed parallel to the snow? Like, we ask these questions of our students in college courses as well, right? We're working on this sort of procedural fluency and skill development, and that work is important. But to many students, the answer to these questions is, who cares? Like, they have no meaning or relevance to the world around them. It's just sort of isolated, decontextualized, siloed academic work. And so we shouldn't be surprised if, like 8th grade me, right, we struggle to find meaning in the question, particularly today when, with a quick search of the language of the question, I can find thousands of people who can help me figure out the answers to that question as well. And 8th grade me was very familiar with this kind of social studies work and social sciences work, where we might learn some basic facts about Eastern and Southeast Asian language families, like the Niger-Congo and the Khoisan and the Uralic and so on, right? But 8th grade me, of course, did not know that that little device that I saw in math club would eventually evolve into learning communities where students voluntarily shared their answers on flashcards with each other, on tools like Quizlet, and helped me understand how to study for and prepare for those questions. And so basically what I'm trying to say here is that 8th grade me was very familiar with this kind of learning, this sort of factual recall and procedural regurgitation work that is important work, right? Like, we still need kids to know stuff and be able to do stuff, but it's at the lower ends of Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge wheel. And the question is that, are we also giving students in higher ed and K-12 the opportunity to live at those upper levels of cognitive complexity, the ones that I highlighted in the bifurcation of the workforce chart, for instance, right? The skills that help them make sense of our complex information landscape around us, that allows them to be not only, workforce ready, but also life ready, as we help them navigate more complex information spaces and economic spaces and so on. And 8th grade me actually didn't get a lot of opportunity to do that. And to be honest, college me didn't either, at least not until, I got to be a junior or a senior and headed into my grad work. A lot of my, early undergraduate coursework looked a lot more like this than it did like this, unfortunately. And when you shove several hundred students into an auditorium, or you run students through a course management system, right? The question is, how do we design for these things as well? And that's really the key point of all of this, is that if we want deeper learning and greater student agency and more authentic work and rich tech infusion to happen, then we have to design for those, right? And so if we were designing for student agency, for instance, then we would ask questions like, who gets to pick what's being learned? And can we move some of that from the instructor to the student? And maybe even if the what that's being learned is a non-negotiable, it's a key core fundamental aspect of the course. There's lots of ways to learn things. So maybe students can have some choice and voice in how something is learned. We can create choice pathways in our online systems and our face-to-face learning systems. We can, recognize that there's lots of different ways that students can demonstrate what they know and their skills and how we assess that. And can we give students some opportunity to have some say in what that looks like, to differentiate some work products rather than making everybody submit the exact same thing. If we are the primary drivers of the talk time in our online spaces, for example, or face-to-face classrooms, can we figure out ways to have students drive that and lead that more often? Can we create opportunities within our online classes or our blended coursework where we can create interest pathways for students, where part of the learning maybe is directed by the teacher, but part of the learning is also directed by the student, where they say, within this topic or within this class, I'm really interested in X, Y, or Z, and I'd like some opportunity to investigate that further and, go beyond some given parameters or go in a different direction to initiate in a new area and reflect those interests and passions in my learning work. And so are we as instructors and institutions, again, creating some of these student agency and choice pathways. On the authentic work standpoint, right, we can ask questions like, do we care if our work stays siloed and decontextualized within the classroom and the LMS? Or can we figure out ways to ask students to take on authentic societal roles as part of their learning, to use the same kind of practices and processes and tools and technologies as people out in the real world, right? Like historians and scientists and business people and artists. And can we have them create real world products or performances for authentic audiences? Can we make contributions to audiences beyond the walls of the LMS, beyond the walls of the university? Can we actually make a difference in our community and have students be part of that work and maybe drive that work? On the deeper thinking and learning front, we can ask questions like, are we ensuring that we're focused around big important themes and concepts that are central to the discipline rather than isolated topics or trivia or minutia? This is particularly challenging in K-12, is to try and help educators create spaces for students where they focus on the big conceptual whys of the discipline, not just the trivia and the minutia. Can we create opportunities in our online spaces where students are engaged in really deep critical thinking and analysis, even if we're not together face to face? Can we create opportunities for them to work on authentic real world problems that are complex and messy, not just simple, like that physics problem that I illustrated earlier? And are we creating opportunities for students to be creative, right? Again, to go beyond, to initiate, to exercise some individuality in the work, and then to reflect on their own thinking and learning and planning work and progress, that important metacognition that we know needs to happen. And then finally, from a tech infusion standpoint, as we think about using our technologies in online learning spaces, are students communicating primarily within the LMS? If so, how? Is it primarily self-contained? Are we giving students a chance to communicate with others outside of the LMS, which tend to be very tight walled gardens? And if so, what tools do they get to use? Not just communicating, but also do they get to collaborate with others in authentic ways to make those real world differences that we know are important? Is the technology adding value to our work, right? Are the tools overshadowing or masking the lack of substantive important learning, and so on? So these are all sort of design questions that we can ask. So the question for you to think about here, this will be our last pause, and then I'll wrap it up with a few final slides. We only have a few minutes left, is can we embrace our roles as instructional designers, even online, as we design for deeper learning?
And we're getting comments about difficulty with students with different technological access. It's an exciting time to be an instructional designer, but we need buy-in from others. It's a crucial time to be an instructional designer.
Okay, welcome back. So we just have a couple minutes left here, so I'm going to kind of wrap things up. So all of those questions come from a protocol that I created called the 4 Shifts protocol. You can access that at bit.ly/4 shifts, and there's also a link to the protocol in that resources page that I gave you at the beginning. I'm also going to note that much of what I've been talking about here echoes a lot of what we know about culturally responsive pedagogy, right? So in which case some of the key precepts of CRP is that pedagogy is asset and interest-based from the students, that instruction is centered around them and their learning needs, that as teachers we operate primarily as facilitators, and that we help our students learn within the context of our larger cultures and communities, that we communicate high expectations for learning, which include not just factual recall and procedure regurgitation, but that deeper learning that we also know we need, and that we reshape our curricula and our coursework accordingly to make sure that we are not only life responsive, but also culturally responsive as our students bring those assets and interests and cultures and communities into our online spaces. So a couple things worth noting here. One is this notion of equity, right? As universities, we have long relied on students to provide basic access to devices and maybe home internet access. I think what we're finding right now during emergency remote instruction during the pandemic is that we may have to rethink some access issues for our students as well as our faculty. And of course, online learning depends on not only robust access, but also robust usage. And so what you've heard me sort of pleading for today as I talk about deeper learning is that if all we're doing is configuring our LMS work and our online coursework to do basic low-level learning and teaching, that we're missing out on the usage aspects and we're leaving behind many of our students in the opportunities to engage in those deeper learning experiences we know they need. You know, another challenge, of course, for higher ed is that many of our faculty were trained primarily to be researchers and not fantastic instructors. And we have relied in the past on inviting faculty to improve their teaching skills through university teaching centers and, you know, IT online learning opportunities for faculty and staff and so on. And I think one of the things we have to wrap our head around is that we have seen the deficiencies of that model again during the pandemic. And the question is, what kind of expectations can we have of faculty to be technology fluent and literate, not just simply inviting them to increase their pedagogical skills, because a lot of that fell apart over the last few months. So ultimately, we have to decide, what do we want our students and graduates to be? Do we want them to be recipients of pre-made, pre-packaged information that gets delivered to them through the online course shell? Or do we want bakers and makers and creators and doers who are actively engaged in their learning and doing awesome things that hopefully make a difference in the world? And if we want more bakers and makers and creators and doers, then the question is, what are we willing to do to get them, right? We have students who are comfortable in these online spaces. They're comfortable with multimedia, at least from a consumption and a social standpoint, if not necessarily an academic or work productive standpoint. They understand what powerful learning can look like because they've tasted the honey at home in ways that may exist outside of our universities and our schools and our online learning spaces. And they're often engaged in work that matters because they're connecting with others, collaborating, creating with each other on a global scale, and they're engaged in work that matters to them and the world around them. And so the question for us then, of course, is that how do we incorporate those shifts into our own online learning experiences? And how do we make sure that our new visions of student possibility outweigh whatever fears and control issues and assumptions about what, classrooms look like, and institutional inertia and all those yes buts that can hold us back, right? Like, what are our deeper learning visions that outweigh all that, and how do we start moving in those directions? And so, this is essentially the beginning of whatever we want to do. And so we have to think really hard about what do we want for our students and our graduates in our university and K-12 communities. And I'm pretty sure that we can do better than what 8th grade me got long ago. And then I hope that you'll join me in this work. Thank you very much.
So Scott, there's going to be a little bit of a delay for people typing questions, but we did get one question earlier. The question is, how do we value experts and expertise while also engaging in authentic work?
So should I go ahead and respond to that question now?
Sure thing.
Do I need to state the question?
They can hear me. So
oh, okay, great.
Ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks. So it's a balance, right? So, I mean, we would be foolish to believe that our instructors and our institutions don't have a lot of expertise and experience that it's worth sharing here. I think the question is, how do we negotiate our learning spaces with our students and recognize that they are also bringing expertise and experience to the table? And that, how do we make sure that learning is something that's done with our students, not something that's done to our students? And that's maybe particularly true in some of these online course shells or these digital adaptive learning systems where students are recipients and consumers of prepackaged information that gets pushed out to them, as opposed to co-designers and co-creators of the learning space. Ultimately, learning for the students should be about them, not just about what we think they should know, but also, do they get to have a say in what they know? As you think about some of those student agency components and the engagement motivation components, we shouldn't be surprised if students in higher education learning spaces struggle to find meaning and motivation, or to try and figure out what their major is, because they're learning foundational stuff, but they never get to connect it to things that they care about or things that they think are important in the world. And so again, it's all a conversation, it's all a discussion with our students. But as designers, we have to think about whether it's face-to-face learning spaces or online or blended or hybrid or whatever, is that how do we include students in that conversation in ways that allow them to extend and deepen their learning, and not make them wait until the final few years of undergrad or grad school to get to do that work.
Great, thank you. Sort of coming off of that, someone is also asking, how do we incorporate and develop evaluations?
So that's a pretty large generic question, right? And I think, one of the things that we have to do as instructors, as universities, is we have to identify what are the learning outcomes that we want from our students and our graduates, and how many of those are reflected in our current assessments. We're very good in K-12 and in higher ed at assessing lower level stuff. The kind of stuff that can be captured in some kind of fixed response, multiple choice question, or maybe a brief short essay. But how often do we give students a chance to assess application of that knowledge and their skills out in the real world, for instance, right? And it's going to require some creative thinking for us, particularly in some early sort of foundational courses where students are still learning the discipline in some basic ways. And yet we can still maybe also create ways for them to apply that knowledge and that skill development out in the context around them. And that could be online, right? It doesn't have to be face-to-face community, it could be in the online communities. But this notion, for example, like, when you're teaching a young child how to play basketball, for instance, as the analogy goes, we don't make a kid just practice skills for years and years, and finally, 5 years later, you get to play a game, right? Like this balance of back and forth of skill development and practice, and then let's go out and apply it, and then play a game, and then let's learn from that, and let's go back and do some more practice and skill development, and let's play another game, right? And what does that look like in English? What does that look like in science? What does that look like in, the social sciences and the natural sciences and the physical sciences and education and world languages and whatever we're teaching, right? Like, what does it look like where we give students a chance to dip in and out of real world application and meaning making and sense making and skill development, and then come back to us and practice and do some more foundational work as experts and facilitators as instructors, and then back out into the real world. And what would classes look like? What would online courses look like that allowed students to do that, as opposed to simply remaining contained within the LMS, and engaging in these fairly artificial discussions and submitting things that only the teacher or instructor ever gets to see and then get feedback a month later, right? Like, it's a very different kind of learning modality. And the question is, do you want students to have some of those other opportunities? And if so, how do we design for them?
So we have a question from Shelley. She says, reading and writing is key to learning. Many students have reading and writing challenges that need support. How does more technology/open learning offer enough support for students with these challenges?
Shelley, I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you. And a lot of this, of course, rests on K-12. If you're thinking about higher ed, you can only take what comes to you from the K-12 systems. I think that's an open question, right? Is how do we use online and hybrid and blended spaces to provide students customized support? So that's the theory behind some of these adaptive learning systems, right? You think about a system like a Newton or an ALEKS in K-12, ALEKS. Or a Dreambox. The idea is that the automated systems can sit side by side with the instructor, helping students with some basic fluencies and skill development, while maybe in class with the instructor, you're also doing some more advanced, deeper learning kind of work. Doing that well is a challenge, and I think I work mostly in K-12 schools, and they mostly do it poorly, where they'll just shove a kid in front of the adaptive learning math software, for example, every day for half an hour, and they never really blend that or build that into the coursework in a way that seems to be productive for kids. So kids check out of those adaptive systems pretty quickly. But that's the theory, at least, right? Is that, as instructors with 20, 40, 80, 400 students, whatever we have in our online course or our face-to-face higher ed course, is that there's no way that we can individually tutor every student who needs it. But maybe some of these online systems, these self-paced tutorials and adaptive software programs and other sort of digital and online modalities can help accompany the work that we're doing as an instructor and maybe help students catch up in areas that they need to. But doing that well requires, some serious instructional design work. And so I would encourage you to lean into whatever resources you have to help with that.
So I think we're going to wrap up with this last question, which is, I'm sure, on many people's mind. We have a question from Diane and also a comment from someone else about retaining good teachers, even though they have to do all of this extra work. But Diane's question is, how do we get buy-in to design this way, especially in terms of time and resources?
So great questions there. I think ultimately, again, we have to decide what kind of learner outcomes do we want. We're having these conversations at K-12 about graduate profiles and learner profiles, and it feels like we need to do the same thing in higher ed. And we shouldn't maybe just leave that to individual instructors or maybe even departments or programs, but how do we have the university-wide conversation, as messy as that will be, about what kind of graduates do we want and what experiences during their higher ed coursework will allow them to acquire those outcomes. And if we want deeper learners, if we want students to be critical thinkers and problem solvers who are excellent communicators and collaborators who can use technology in productive ways to further that work, then we have to design for those experiences within courses, across program sequences, within our online course shells, and so on. And so, I keep preaching this idea of being designers, but most universities are so distributed down to the lowest level in terms of instructors making these choices, and it would really be productive for us to have conversations at the program, department, college, and university level to help us align some of this stuff and think about what are we missing from our learners' experiences and those desired learning outcomes that right now isn't there, and then structure pathways to make those happen.
Scott, Thank you so much. On behalf of Rutgers, thank you for kicking off our conference. Thank you for stretching us and our thinking. Thanks also for opening up pathways for us to deeper learning. And we again are delighted that you were able to be with us and to set our conference off, our virtual conference off on such an exciting and insightful first step. So thank you again. This is a critical time to be an instructional designer. This is the time to make a difference. And I think you have shown that to us in many examples and have teased out for us many ways in which we can do more. There is much more that we can do, starting with reflecting on our own practice. And let's start there together. I think the other takeaway that we have all learned as we are still in the midst of this pandemic is that we are never going back. The world has changed. The infusion of technology in instruction, the preponderance of online learning now is never going back. It is only going forward. And I think, Scott, that you laid out for us some exciting opportunities for the future. Of we can use this as a springboard, and we can take this further. And there is much more that all of us can do.